Well, this morning's passage is the third time, as Sue actually read in the title of this passage. This is Jesus' third prediction about his death in Mark's Gospel. And he's reiterating quite strongly for the disciples that he is walking on a path toward Jerusalem and the cross. It's a path that the disciples didn't expect. And in spite of their bafflement, their fear, they're still walking with Jesus. And I'd like to point out that, again here, we have in Mark's Gospel a sort of a three-part pattern, a threefold pattern, where Jesus teaches about Messiahship. The disciples misunderstand, so they have a response that is the getting it wrong again. And then Jesus explains to them. There's the teaching element. You know, he throws out a pearl of wisdom. They show how they don't understand. And then he explains it to them. And so in this passage, directly after Jesus explains that he's going to Jerusalem, will be handed over to first the chief priests and the officials. They will judge him, they'll condemn him, they'll hand him over to the Romans, who will torture him and ridicule him. They'll crucify him, and on the third day he will rise again. So he explains that really clearly. And James and John's response is to come to Jesus and say, Lord, can we sit at your right and at your left when you enter your glory? Now, it's interesting that they use the term your glory right here off the back of what Jesus said and his prediction. He's going to Jerusalem. And it's most likely that they are understanding this, when you come in your glory, as in when we get to Jerusalem and everything goes our way and you're, put in some place of authority, we want to be right there with you. It could be too that they're actually thinking more eschatologically, so in the end times thing, when Jesus is in his heavenly glory, that they'd like to sit beside him on the left and right. Either way, the nature of their request, that they want these positions of honour, show that they have not grasped what Jesus is trying to say about greatness and about what it would look like to follow in his footsteps. They show that they haven't got that part of it. Whether they're thinking in the next few days or in the hereafter, they haven't really understood that part of it. And so it's interesting really, because along with Peter, James and John have been Jesus' closest friends. They're the ones in the intimate circle with Jesus right from the beginning. But it's almost the closer they get to Jerusalem, this request of theirs shows they are not seeing Jerusalem as a place of the cross, but as a place of sort of public recognition and hopefully glory. When Jesus talks about the cup, can you drink from the cup that I drink from? They say, yes, yes, yes. But if you look through passages of Scripture, you realise that often, through the Psalms and Jeremiah particularly, when they talk about the cup, it is the cup of suffering that they're referring to. When Jesus talks about being baptised in the baptism that he is baptised with, you remember that phrase, baptism, actually means to be immersed, to be submerged, to be drowned in something. And so we might say, in our language, you might say to be immersed into trouble or to be submerged in evil would be the normal kind of language he would be using. And they skip straight over that, as if he's only talking about, beer and Skittles and hot bubble baths and chocolate. They've missed it completely. They're thinking completely positive things when his language, when his predictions are actually that this is going to be a very difficult way. So that's them getting it wrong, if you like. That's the misunderstood discipleship passage. And the third part is this discipleship in the way of Jesus, where Jesus explains it. And he talks to them, he gathers them all up, because when the other disciples notice James and John asking for this special request, do for us whatever we ask of you. Well, what do you want? We want to sit at your right and at your left. They get angry. Now, it's not angry because they know this request to sit in Jesus' left and right when he comes in his glory, that's just wrong. They should be acting like servants. No, they're angry because they feel that somebody's beaten them to the front of the line and pushed in. They're all thinking the same thing. They're all trying to be at the front of the line in terms of Jesus' disciples. And Jesus, knowing that, gathers them all together, not just James and John. He gathers them all together. And he says the human one didn't come into this world to be served, but to serve, and to give his life to liberate many people. They all needed to hear that teaching because they all had their own little versions of power plays or one-upmanship, their own ideas of what it should look like to be a great follower of Jesus. And each one of them had misunderstood. Jesus was saying, if you want to be great, you need to be a servant. If you want to be first, you need to become the slave of all. And that is a paradigm shift for them. One that they're struggling, even though they've heard it before, they're struggling to let go of their own ideas of greatness. But Jesus doesn't really condemn them. He doesn't get out a big stick and beat them with it. Rather, he more or less changes and redirects their strivings. They're wanting to be great followers. They've just got slightly the wrong idea of it. And so he doesn't say, you've got it all wrong. He actually says, this is the direction of your energy, of your striving. So if you want to be great, become a servant. If you want to be first, become like a slave. That is Jesus' way. That is God's way. And so he's really just contrasting like the earthly way, the way that they see the Romans in power, in positions of authority, and they deal it out to the people below. And he's contrasting that with how God's kingdom looks and how Jesus' way on earth is. Each must become a servant and a slave. For Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life to liberate many people. And I want to point out, often the translations use the word ransom, give his life a ransom for many. But there's some other things that we bring to that, other imagery that's not actually in Mark's mindset. Because ransom sometimes means like a payment, that Jesus is going to pay to get us off. And so we tend to be thinking about the notion of our sin, that he pays for our sin so that we can be free. But this is not a passage about our sin. It's a passage about greatness and about authority. And Jesus here, it's more like the liberate that we would understand God liberating his people from the land of Egypt. It wasn't so much a payment, it was a liberation act. God comes in and removes his people, frees his people so that they can be his people. And that's what Jesus is doing for us. He liberates us from the worldly kind of notions of greatness, from our ideas of being fantastic and great and powerful, or having positions of authority, all of those grandiose ideas that we have, and he's freeing us from those, being enthralled by those things, that we can be freed from them to just be like Christ. Humble, a servant, a slave. One who gives his life to free others. And we know what depths Jesus will go to lead us back to God. He would give everything and stop at nothing. The fact that we know that, we have read the end of the story, if you like, not like the disciples in this particular instance. We know where Jerusalem leads. We should know better than they. Yet sometimes we still are caught up. We're still enthralled by, the greatness of the world. Ideas of power or authority. Striving for our own ends. And Jesus would do everything to free us from that. From our ambitions, from our desires, for our own greatness, that we might serve in his name. It's interesting when you think about the disciples. They signed up to follow Jesus, this teacher who shows them, amazing things, is doing miraculous things around them. And crowds of people are following him quite often on his way. It's easy to understand that they would be thinking, wow, this is gaining momentum, they're gaining, in reputation, things are really going places. But they could be thinking down those lines, that they were following someone great, that they were tying themselves, binding themselves to someone powerful, because he is powerful. But what they get instead of that is service in the name of the suffering servant. And they're called to follow in that way of suffering. I wanted to just finish with John Wesley's covenant prayer. And it's an interesting one. It's one that there are perhaps lines in there, in this prayer of covenanting to God, that might inwardly make us cringe a little bit. A bit like the disciples. We say, yes, we want to be just like you. We want to be thick as thieves with you, Christ. And then he says, great, because that's going to mean suffering and it's going to mean slavery. And we go, really? Okay. Those elements, it's easy to say, it's much harder to do. John Wesley, I think in this prayer, really strongly causes us to ponder, do we really mean what we wish for? We wish to be like Jesus. Do we really mean it? So I'll read it out to you. We're going to have it on a PowerPoint, and I want you to pray it. But before we start that, I wanted to read it to you so you know what you're buying into. I never like saying something up on the screen, being told, we're going to say this together, and I don't know what it says. So I'll read it for you and then invite you to pray it quietly, carefully, but honestly to yourself. So the prayer goes like this. I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Place me with whom you will. Put me to doing. Put me to suffering. Let me be put to work for you or set aside for you. Praised for you or criticised for you. Let me be full. Let me be empty. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and fully surrender all things to your glory and service. And now, O wonderful and holy God, Creator Redeemer, Sustainer. You are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant which I have made on earth, let it also be made in heaven. Amen. So I'd invite you to pray this prayer. It is just in silence. I'm not going to ask you to all say it out loud. Read it in your own time and pray it. It's a covenant between you and God. You're giving your life into God's hands for his purposes, whatever that might mean.